What is going on, shrimp keepers? So today is such an amazing day. It is the kickoff to a series that I did many years ago and I wanted to bring back. If you guys remember, it's called Shrimp Saturday. So happy Saturday to all of you. Hopefully you guys are having a good start to your weekend. And I just want to come to you with a shrimp specific video. So I'm really excited to bring these back. If you guys don't know me, I'm Rob at Flipaquatics. I'm the owner of Flipaquatics. And we specialize in shrimp, nanofish, snails, plants, all of the different things. But today, I want to talk about a topic that I spent a lot of time with this specific type of shrimp. And what I want to cover today is crystal shrimp. I want to dive in deep, go over every single part that you would have questions about, hopefully. If I miss any, drop a question down below. We'll make sure to include it in a future video. But we're going to be talking about all crystal shrimp, the types, the care of, grading, different care parameters that you need to be watching out for. We're going to get in depth, and this is everything you need to know to be successful with keeping crystal shrimp. So with that being said, let's jump right into today's video. So let's kick crystal shrimp off by talking about the different types. So first of all, most of you have probably heard of the famous crystal red shrimp. A lot of people call it CRS. So if you've ever seen CRS, it means crystal red shrimp. There's also crystal black shrimp and a golden bee. Those are the three most common types of crystal shrimp. Now, a crystal red is one that's white and red. A crystal black is one that's black and white. And then a golden bee is usually a white shrimp, but it could be pink, could be orange, has a bunch of different colors to it. So a long time ago, the way that they bred a crystal red shrimp, or to get a higher grade crystal red shrimp, which has more white coloration, which we'll talk about that here in a little bit, is what they would do is they would breed a golden bee with a crystal red shrimp, and that would help bring out the white coloration. So that's why there's a crystal red, crystal black, and a golden bee. That's like the triangle. Now, if you've ever heard the term pure line, so like pure red line, pure black line, that is a crystal shrimp, but it's pure. And what that means is it's never been contaminated with different genetics. So it's a straight line. That means never ever has the crystal red been crossed with a golden bee or any other type of shrimp to bring out a certain coloration. And then there's also something that would be considered crystal shrimp, but it's called a mischling. Now, mischling is a Taiwan bee and a crystal cross. So when you breed a Taiwan bee with a crystal shrimp, it produces crystal shrimp. They look identical to crystal shrimp. The only difference is about 25% of their genetics are going to be Taiwan bees. And so when you breed, let's say you breed two mischling shrimp together, there's a small chance that you'll get Taiwan bees out of them. And that's how you know it's a mischling. So you can't tell by actually looking at them. So if you buy crystal red shrimp or crystal blacks or any crystal shrimp and all of a sudden you get a Taiwan bee, it means you actually have mischlings. And so there's a lot to do with genetics, but that kind of gives you a broad overview of the different type of crystal shrimp. Next up, let's talk about grading. So there's two ways to grade crystal shrimp. We'll start with the one that's the hardest to grade, and that would be the golden bee. Golden bee is also referred to as a snow white. So basically in those, you're referring to the amount of white pigmentation it has. So like ones that are pink, you know, you probably wouldn't be high grade or they're kind of clear. You're looking for ones that have the solid white coloration. So if you get ones that are like solid white, those are very high golden bees, are very high grade. And then if you have ones that are just kind of patchy colors, those would be considered regular grade or low grade. And so that's the golden bee side. And one thing to know about with golden bees and snow whites, a lot of times breeders from Taiwan will try to sneak some, low grade blue bolts in there. So you'll get some blue coloration. If you ever see blue coloration, that's not a golden bee, it's not a snow white, it is a blue bolt. You'll never get blue in golden bee. So moving on to the crystal shrimp. Now this refers to crystal red, crystal black, pure red line, pure black line. As far as pure line and the crystal line, there's no difference as far as appearance. They're gonna look exactly the same. It's not like one's high grade, one's low grade. They're just different genetics. So as far as the grade, there's two ways to grade them. One is based on the color, like how good the color is as far as transparency, is it solid color? So like if you have one that like the legs are solid white or the legs are solid red and the red coloration is completely solid, it's not patchy, and the white coloration is solid and it's not patchy, that's a very high grade shrimp. Now you could have ones that the red or black color is really nice, but the white color is kind of patchy, and then that's like mid-grade, maybe low-grade. And so that's one way to grade them, is based on the intensity of their color. The next way to grade them is based on their pattern. So there's high-grade patterns, which the pattern is SS, SS, S, and then I think A, and then B. It's been a while since I've had to grade crystal reds, but very rarely do you see like A and B grade. And there is a C grade too, which is pretty much a solid color shrimp, but that's actually very sought after. So on the crystal side, the crystal red side, it's called a Santa crystal red. And that means it's pretty much solid red with a little bit of white. And so we didn't talk about that earlier. And then crystal black, a super crystal black, is just a C grade crystal black. And that means it's pretty much solid black with a little bit of white. And so those ones are really pretty. And so the pattern, a high grade pattern in the scale of actually grading is SSS, is the highest grade. And that means that there's very little red or black and almost completely white. And then it even goes further. There's different grades, like there's like a crown grade, which means it just has like the tiniest bit of red or black on the very tip of its head. And so there's a lot of different grades you can go for it, but they don't necessarily mean that like one's better than the other. It really is what you're going for. And so a lot of people like the ones that have a lot of white, and a lot of people like the ones that have a lot of black or red. And so really depends on what you're looking for. But in my opinion, the most important thing to grade for is color intensity. That's what matters to me, and I believe that's what should matter to you. Next up, let's talk about actually setting up one of these tanks, or the parameters that you need. So first of all, you need to know crystals like soft water. They like acidic water. So what we aim for is a pH below 7. Ideally a pH in the 6s. You could go down to the 5s. Once you get below the 5s, it gets a little dicey, so I don't recommend it. But how do you achieve a low pH? And so here's what we do. The first thing I'm gonna recommend is using RO water. RO water, RODI water, distilled water, it's all very much the same. Basically what you're trying to do is strip all the nutrients out of the water, and that would give you a TDS of 0. I always say a TDS of 10 or less would be considered water that I would use. Anything over a TDS of 10 is not something that I would use because there's too much contaminants in it. And just for all of you at home that don't know what TDS stands for total dissolved solids. It's a good way to measure how clean water is. It's only good on the initial setup phase. It's not really, applicable moving forward and like actually setting up the tank. There are some times that you could use it, but for the most part, I would not rely on TDS as a measurement on its own. It's just a good indicator if the water's clean or not clean when grading your RO water or DI water. And so once you have your RO water, you can't just use straight RO water that has no mineral content in it. You need to remineralize it. And that's where a product like Shrimpful GH Plus comes into play. So for us, we actually developed Shrimpful GH Plus, which is a general hardness remineralizer. Basically, it's adding calcium back into the water so that the animals can use that calcium to actually grow. And a lot of plants use it and things like that. So you have to have some hardness in your water, at least for the most part. For the sake of crystal reds, you need it. And what I aim for is a GH of 6. So 6 degrees. Now, there's parts per million, which I believe the translation is 18.2 equals 1 degree. So if you're going by that, times 6 by 18.2, that would give you parts per million. You need to have GH in your water, and they do like a little bit more GH in their water relative to other Caridina species like Taiwan bees and things like that. And so they like a little bit on the harder side, but still acidic water. And so that's what you're gonna aim for. So you need an active substrate. An active substrate is actually what's gonna hold your pH down. So we use Rio Scuro, it's a Brightwell product. It's an active soil, and that means it's pulling the KH out of the water, absorbing it into the soil, and then that brings your pH down. Now there's other ways that you could lower the pH. I've never been able to do it successfully and get shrimp to breed. So I highly recommend you getting a active soil like Brightwell, and then using a GH remineralizer on RO water, distilled water, whatever you want to choose. And that is going to give you the ideal parameter. So if you're getting shrimp from us, I would aim for a GH of 6. And then the last thing as far as water parameters that I would be watching for is temperature. Caridina shrimp in general like a temperature that's low. 70 to 72 degrees is the high end of where I like to keep them. I prefer to keep them at like 68. The only thing is they grow slower, but they live a lot longer. They breed longer for you. You're not stressing them out. There's a lot less room for air. And so those are all things as far as, the parameters of the water. Now, for the actual tank setup, I'm biased, but I think it's literally the best filter that you could buy, and that's a matte filter. So a matte filter is a great filter. It operates by a solid wall of sponge, and that is the home for the bacteria. And then it has what's called a lift tube, which is basically an L-shaped PVC pipe that forces air from the bottom all the way up to the top, back into the other side of the aquarium, because the aquarium is divided by the matte filter. And then you have a whole wall of live bacteria. And what ends up happening is the shrimp will graze on that matte filter. They will eat the microorganisms that are living there, and they are gonna be super, super happy. Another thing to consider when like cycling a tank for Caridina shrimp is live bacteria doesn't like existing in a pH below 7. The good news is ammonia is non-lethal in a pH below 7 unless in really, really high concentrations. And so there's a lot of flexibility when cycling a Caridina shrimp. That doesn't mean you should set one up today and use it tomorrow. I would highly recommend you go through the process of cycling a low pH tank, and how I would do that is literally get your whole tank set up, get it set up the way that you want, and you can either dose with ammonia, you can put some food down there, let it produce some ammonia on its own, and then once you start seeing NO3s, which is nitrates, that's how you know your cycle is complete, and then you can add shrimp. But you do have a lot of flexibility because the pH is below 7, ammonia is non-lethal, so you do have a little bit of wiggle room. I don't recommend using it, but it's there if you need it. So as far as like decor that I would recommend for the tank, there's 3 things that I always recommend for every shrimp tank: moss, driftwood, and almond leaves, Indian almond leaves. Those are my 3 favorites. So botanicals are really good. They break down the water, they release tannins, they also lower your pH a little bit. They fight off bacterial infections, fungal infections, just they break down, they create biofilm. There's so many good uses for botanicals. I love Indian almond leaves. Alder cones would also be great. And there's plenty of other options out there. You guys can do your research and pick which one's best for you. But those are the 2 that I would recommend. Driftwood, also technically considered a botanical, but a really, really great product. The reason I like it so much is it has a lot of nooks and crannies for the shrimp to get into, hide, do their business, and just be not stressed out. There's also a lot of microorganisms that were growing it, also biofilm. And so my favorite type of driftwood, Malaysian driftwood. I also really like spiderwood. That produces a lot of biofilm. So there's a lot of great options as far as spiderwood. Now moving on to like the moss. Now this, you could go a lot of different ways. Java moss obviously is the #1 choice most people pick, but there's a lot of cool moss out there. Christmas moss, mini Christmas moss, Taiwan moss, Substrate, like so on and so forth. I personally love Substrate. Isn't really considered a moss, but it's a really, really cool plant. Do some research. I'm sure Em will edit something over this video and you guys will be looking at it right now. Love it. Highly recommend it. And then the last thing that I would recommend for a Caridina setup is a floating plant. The reason I recommend a floating plant is it's gonna reduce your evaporation, it's gonna reduce your maintenance, it's gonna pull NO3s out of the water if you ever have high NO3s. And so there's a lot of benefits to keeping floating plants. Also, the little roots always dangle down, creates more surface area, more places for babies to hide, and a lot of good reasons for you to keep it. So that is a general setup and a couple things that I would add in to make sure you guys have success keeping them. Next up, I want to talk about feeding. So feeding is one of those things that, let me just start off. If you're currently keeping crystal shrimp or shrimp in general, you have a food that you like and it's working, I would just keep doing the same thing. I would never fall into the trap of just buying a food just to buy it because someone recommended it. Although I do have 3 types of food that I highly want to recommend, or I guess there's like 5 types of food that I really like, but I'll give you the reasons why. So first of all, Bacter AE, it is an absolute amazing food. We've been feeding it since I started in the hobby like 14 years ago, 13 years ago. It's basically ground up biofilm. And so love using it, highly recommend Bacter AE. I'm sure there'll be a link down below, you can check that out. The next thing would be a snowflake food. And the reason I like this is because it won't foul your aquarium. So if you're going on vacation, throw a couple of those pellets in there, it won't foul your water, and it'll give your shrimp something to graze on for the next couple days where you're gone, the next week, so on and so forth. And then the last 3 types of food that I just want to touch on. One is I think you need a complete food. A complete food is an everyday food that you feed, and it's really good nutrition value, specific for shrimp, maybe not specific for shrimp, but it's a good everyday food that is a complete food that you can feed. Now the next thing is a mineral food. So if you ever have shrimp that are, for whatever reason, not molting correctly, they're dying during molt, they're not getting their full molt off, then I would recommend feeding a mineral food. Mineral food is usually coated in like a white powder. There's a lot of different brands out there you could try. I personally like Shrimp Envy if you want to check them out. I know we sell it on the website. You can also search them, and they're really great people, Rob and Ree. And so I do recommend that. And then the last thing would be a protein food. A protein food, the reason this is important, if you ever have a shrimp that is berry die, it's usually due to a protein deficiency. So that's when I would recommend feeding a protein food. So those are like the 3 food groups that I recommend having on hand at all times. You don't need to feed them always, but you could, feed a protein food once a week, a mineral food once a week, and then your everyday food, fill in the gaps from there. So those are the food types that I would recommend. Now, as far as like how much to feed, my goal is always that the shrimp eat the food within 2 hours. So if I feed food and it's still there 2 hours later, I fed too much. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull that food out. I'm gonna wait 2 days, I'm gonna feed it again. Now, if they don't attack it again, I'm probably gonna wait another 3 or 4 days to try to feed it again. And if they do attack it, but then there's still food left over after 2 hours, I know I need to reduce the amount that I'm feeding, not the frequency. So there's a couple ways that you can really gauge it, but really dialing in your food is super important. And my recommendation is always less is better. I personally have never seen a shrimp starve to death, ever. They're always grazing on something. So that's feeding. A couple different options there, give you some things to think about, and we'll move on to the next topic. This is a question I get all the time is, what fish or what can I keep with my shrimp? So crystal shrimp specifically, you have to know they like soft water. Now, why that's important is anything that you're gonna keep with them has to also like soft water. So initially, a lot of people say like endlers, guppies would be great for keeping with your shrimp. Crystal shrimp, that's not true because guppies, endlers like hard water. So now you need something like soft water. And the recommendation I'm gonna give for you is micro rasboras. So chili rasboras, exclamation point, spotted rasboras, mirror rasboras, all really great options. Now, can they eat baby shrimp? They could, it's just not a normal thing that they would do. So those are really great options. Other things could be like plecos, otocinclus, things that like lower pH that aren't really gonna disturb your shrimp habitat is what I would recommend. The only problem with using plecos and like otos is they will compete for the food of your shrimp, and that might not be good, whereas like the microrasboras will not. So my #1 recommendation would be the microrasboras. You could use snails. I recommend snails for neocardinas all the time. The only problem is they don't really do great in a low pH. So that's why microrasboras would be my #1 tank recommendation for crystal shrimp. Have your shrimp now. What do you actually have to do to maintain this aquarium? Now, a lot of people will want to get in there, keep it pristine, clean, make sure everything looks great. The best thing you could do for shrimp, leave them alone. Set them up the way that they need to be set up. Make sure you have the right filter, right water parameters, right substrate, and then set them up, put them in there, let them do their thing. The one thing you need to know is like, it's normal when you get shrimp for the first 30 days to have, 1 or 3 losses depending on. So the biggest thing is don't panic. Like, losses happen, it's okay. Giving them stability is the most important thing you could do. So what do you actually have to do for maintenance? #1 is evaporation. You need to know that evaporation happens. That's why we recommend floating plants to reduce that. And when evaporation happens, water leaves the aquarium, but the minerals stay behind. So that's where you need to top off with RO water, distilled water, to make sure that the mineral content doesn't change. And that's where TDS could come into play, or total dissolved solids. If you know that your aquarium sits at 100 TDS or 150 TDS, then you know that if it's 200, you have too many minerals in there, maybe evaporation has gotten the best of you, and that could trigger you to do a water change. Now, as far as doing water changes, what do I recommend? Less is always better. So as long as you're not overfeeding, you have detritus worms everywhere, planaria taking over, like there's a lot of things that go wrong if you're overfeeding. So again, less is always better. Less food is definitely better than more food. And so I never recommend getting in there and siphoning the aquarium unless you absolutely have to. But as far as your normal water changes, I normally put like a mesh screen over my hose that I'm siphoning the water out. I don't get it down in the substrate unless I really have to. And then I'll do a water change like once a month, maybe twice a month if I'm really going for it. And then my biggest recommendation is siphon it into a bucket, know the line that you drained in the bucket, and then fill that same bucket up to the same line, and then know that that's how much water you took out, that's how much you need to put back in. And then I'll actually put the bucket up on the rim of the aquarium, right where it comes together, the L part, set it there, and then just drip that water back in, a nice steady stream. That way you don't really have to worry about sudden changes, because the biggest mistake that you can make with any shrimp is having the water change too rapidly. And so you want it to be slow, steady, over a long period of time. Maybe drip it back in over 30 minutes, an hour, however long you can go. And again, I would recommend that water change, once, twice a month is more than enough. If you're a very experienced hobbyist, you could do it more often. I just don't think it's needed. Although I do think topping off for evaporation, daily, weekly, every other day, something like that is a very good practice to do. Last but certainly not least, I want to talk about breeding these guys, and is it worth it? Is it something that I would suggest? Now, crystal shrimp, they usually retail for about, depending on the type, you might be able to find them as cheap as like $4 or $5, expensive, or as expensive as like $20, depending on like the type. And so like I know like high grade Santa Claus crystal reds are really expensive. I know high grade super crystal blacks are very expensive. So there's gonna be some very expensive ones, even like some of the pure lines. Like there might be a pure line shrimp that's like $100, maybe $1,000 if you're getting like the highest end. And so is it worth it to breed it? Absolutely. I think if somebody really wanted to corner the market or do this as a hobbyist, they could have 50 tanks of crystal shrimp and really be the best in the business and do it to just to be exceptional and really have some good lines that they're working with, because it does come a lot down to genetics and knowing where you're getting them from. So I think it's really worth it, but how do you actually get them to breed? So in my experience, if you're keeping the temperature, around that 68 degrees, they'll breed twice a year. And usually it's in the spring and it's in the fall. Those are the two best breeding seasons, at least for us here at Flipaquatics. And so if you're trying to breed them 4 or 5 times a year, you got to have that higher temperature, and I wouldn't recommend it because then the risk of like bacterial infections just goes to the roof. So I would definitely say keep your water cool, breed them twice a year, and the only thing you need to make sure you have is males and females. Now, females are going to have what's called a skirt, which is their tail. On a male, the bottom of the tail is straight, whereas on females, it's nice and curved. And the reason females have a skirt is because as they breed, they bring their eggs down to their tail and they put them on their swimmerettes and they fan them so that they don't get, fungal or bacteria builds up on them. And so they're constantly fanning them, and the skirt protects the eggs. And so that's one way to tell. And if you're ever curious, you can take your shrimp, you can put them in a clear container, shine a light underneath them, and normally you can see females will have what's called a saddle, which is the eggs making their way down their back, and males will never have a saddle. So that's another way just to sex them real quick if you can't tell. But if you have 10 shrimp, most likely you have a good mix of males and females. And so my biggest recommendation for you guys is trust the process, don't rush it. If you've set up your tank right, you've done all the things, you have the right water parameters, then I certainly would not stress about them breeding. Just give them time, they'll breed. Normally around like the 6 months to 1 year mark is when you'll start getting breeding. In my experience, shrimp live about 3 to 4 years if they're properly taken care of and you don't have them in high temperatures. A lot of things you'll read online will say like 2 years, and normally that's because they're keeping them in that higher temperature and they're growing quicker than they need to and they burn out a lot faster. So I'm always slow and steady wins the race. I want to do it right, and I don't want to put too much stress on the animal, and I want to, kind of make things as stable as possible, and lower temperatures will definitely make that a possibility. So if you do everything in this video and follow these tips, I do believe that you're going to start breeding crystal red shrimp. Just don't rush the process. Don't rush the process. Give it some time, and you'll be successful. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our Amazing Shrimp Saturday, episode 1, returning strong. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If there's any questions that I missed, please comment down below. We want to answer them. We want to know what we missed, and we want to include it on future videos. Thank you guys so much for being a part of the Flipaquatics family. I know I'm happy to be back. Hopefully you guys are happy to see, this nice smiley face. But I hope you guys make it a great rest of your week. As always, God bless. We'll catch you on the flip side.